The Speed Skier. February 22, 1992. The air at Les Arcs is freezing, but the adrenaline is boiling. This is the morning of the Olympic speed skiing finals, a day when athletes turn themselves into human missiles. Nicolas Bochete is clicking into his bindings, focused on a gold medal and a world record. Nicolas has spent his life chasing the limit of human speed, but in minutes, he will discover that the limit is made of solid steel. Speed skiing was the ultimate daring event of the Albertville Winter Games. It wasn't about style or tricks, it was about raw, terrifying velocity. Imagine strapping long, heavy planks to your feet, tucking into a tiny ball, and pointing yourself straight down a mountainside that looks more like a cliff. You aren't just skiing. You are traveling at highway speeds with zero brakes and nothing but a thin helmet for protection. Nicolas was built for this. The Swiss skier was a master of the mountain. He didn't just stumble into speed skiing, he studied it like a science. He knew exactly how to slice through the wind and how to stay calm when the snow beneath him became a blur. In the community of speed skiers, Nicolas was respected as a veteran who had spent years preparing for this exact moment, the chance to show the entire world what he could do on the Olympic stage. The 1992 Games were supposed to be the big breakthrough for speed skiing. It was being featured as a demonstration sport, which is basically a high-stakes job interview to see if an event is safe and exciting enough to stay in the Olympics permanently. For Nicolas, the pressure was immense. He wasn't just skiing for himself, he was skiing for the survival of his sport. Every movement had to be precise. One mistake wouldn't just hurt him, it could get the sport banned. The course at Les Arcs was legendary for being steep and incredibly fast. To prepare for the final race, Nicolas and his teammates decided to take a routine warm-up run on a public slope nearby. The sun was out, the visibility was perfect, and the snow was firm. It was supposed to be a simple way to get the legs moving and the blood pumping before the real competition began. There was no reason to think anything would go wrong on a standard mountain trail. But on this mountain, the line between a routine warm-up and a death trap is about to vanish in a cloud of snow. As Nicolas tucked into a high-speed position, he hit a small, natural bump in the terrain. At the speeds he was traveling, even a tiny bump in the snow acts like a takeoff ramp. Nicolas went airborne, his skis losing contact with the ground for a split second. It's a common occurrence for pros, but when his skis finally touched back down, the world in front of him had changed. Directly in his path was a snowcat, a massive snow grooming machine. The machine was doing its job, its yellow lights flashing and its siren wailing to warn people to stay away. But Nicolas was moving faster than a car on an open freeway. At 120 miles per hour, there is no such thing as braking. There is only the impact. Nicolas struck the heavy machine with such incredible force that he never had a chance. The collision was instantaneous. The speed that had made him an Olympic hero just moments before had now become the very thing that ended his life. His teammates, skiing just behind him, could only watch in horror as the morning's excitement turned into a scene of absolute chaos. The news hit the Olympic Village like a lightning bolt. While the finals technically moved forward, the heart was gone from the event. Many of his Swiss teammates withdrew immediately, unable to compete while their friend was being carried off the mountain. The job interview for speed skiing had ended in the worst way possible. The consequence was final. The International Olympic Committee saw the tragedy and made a swift, permanent decision. Speed skiing was stripped of its status and scrubbed from all future Olympic programs. It never returned. Nicolas died chasing a dream of speed, and in that moment, the Olympic dream for his entire sport died right along with him. First slider. January 22nd, 1964. The mountain air in Innsbruck is freezing, but the atmosphere is electric. For the first time in history, the Winter Olympics are hosting luge, a sport where humans become human rockets. Kazimierz Skrzypecki is ready to make history, but in less than 24 hours, the ground is going to betray him. The 1964 Games were a massive milestone. Luge was the new kid on the block, and the track at Igls was a monster made of carved ice and steep drops. Imagine traveling at 60 miles per hour, highway speeds, while lying on your back inches from the ground with nothing but a thin suit and a helmet for protection. There are no brakes. There is no steering wheel. It is just you, the ice, and gravity. Kazimierz wasn't your typical athlete. At 30 years old, He was a veteran compared to his teenage rivals, before he ever touched a luge sled. Kazimierz was a pilot for the Royal Air Force. He spent his life in cockpit seats, navigating the skies with military discipline. Kazimierz was used to speed, but flying a plane is controlled. Launching yourself down an icy path in the Austrian mountains is a completely different kind of chaos. In Britain, luge barely existed. Kazimierz didn't just join the team, he built it. He spent years recruiting athletes and convincing people that sliding down ice at lethal speeds was a legitimate Olympic dream rather than a suicidal hobby. He was the heart of the sport in his country because he was a pilot. He had a positive attitude that made everyone around him feel safe, even when they were doing something incredibly dangerous. The Innsbruck track was a brand new challenge. Every day, athletes took training runs to memorize the curves and find the fastest line through the ice. As a pioneer of the sport, Kazimierz felt a massive weight on his shoulders. He knew that if the British team performed poorly, or if the event looked boring, luge might be kicked out of the Olympics forever. To save the sport's future, he pushed himself to go faster and take risks that others wouldn't dare. On January 21st, 1964, that pressure turned into a nightmare. During a high-speed training run, Kazimierz lost control on one of the most treacherous curves of the course. His sled didn't just slide, it shot off the racing line like a missile. He slammed into the track barriers with a sound that echoed through the woods. The force of the impact was so violent it sent him tumbling across the rough ice. The damage was bad. Kazimierz suffered a fractured skull, a massive head trauma, and a shattered pelvis in multiple places. When medical teams reached Kazimierz, he was unconscious and bleeding heavily. The highway speed crash had broken his body in ways that 1960s medicine was barely equipped to handle. Kazimierz was rushed to a local hospital where surgeons worked frantically. They spent the entire night trying to stop the bleeding in his brain and repair the internal damage. His teammates waited in the hallways, praying that the man who had taught them how to slide would survive the ultimate crash. On January 22nd, 1964, the battle ended. During emergency surgery, Kazimierz Skrzypecki's heart stopped. Despite every effort to restart it, he was gone. The aftermath was immediate and grim. The Olympic luge competition didn't stop, but the mood at the games shifted from celebration to mourning. Coaches stand. September 5th, 1972. Pre-dawn darkness clings to the Olympic Village in Munich, West Germany. The world's greatest athletes are sleeping peacefully in a place designed to be a symbol of friendship and peace. Moshe Weinberg is about to make the most important stand of his life, and he is about to pay for it with everything. The 1972 Munich Olympics were supposed to show the world a new, friendly side of Germany. To prove how peaceful they were, organizers kept security light. There were no armed guards, no tall fences, and no checkpoints. Athletes from different countries walked in and out of the village like it was a summer camp. No one anticipated that this atmosphere of trust would soon become a door left wide open for a nightmare. This was the Carefree Games, a celebration of life that was intentionally left vulnerable to prove that the world had moved past its violent history. Moshe was a 32-year-old wrestling coach for the Israeli team. He was a man of immense strength and even greater heart. He had spent years building Israel's wrestling program from nothing, turning young athletes into international competitors through grit and sheer willpower. To his team, Moshe wasn't just a coach, he was a protector. He lived and breathed the sport, and on this morning, he was staying in apartment 1 on Connollystrasse, just feet away from the men he had trained to be champions. He was the guardian of their dreams, never imagining he would soon be the guardian of their lives. The peace of the Olympic morning is a fragile mask, and 8 shadows are about to tear it off with military precision. For months, a group of terrorists from the Black September organization had been studying the layout of the village. They knew exactly where the Israeli team slept. They knew the security guards carried no weapons and were mostly there to give directions. They knew that at 4:30 a.m., the only thing standing between them and their targets was a simple wooden door. As the rest of the world slept, 8 gunmen climbed over the low perimeter fence, their bags filled with assault rifles and grenades. They were not there to compete. They were there to turn the world stage into a theater of war. The attackers moved toward apartment 1. Moshe was the first to hear the scratching at the door. He didn't wait to see who it was. He felt the danger instantly. As the door began to creak open, Moshe threw his massive athletic frame against it. He screamed at the top of his lungs, waking his teammates and telling them to run for their lives. lives. His strength was the only thing holding back a group of armed men who were desperate to force their way inside. In this doorway, a coach becomes a human shield, and the price of a teammate's life is his own. Because Moshe held the door with every ounce of his strength, one wrestler, Gad Sobari, managed to scramble out of a window and escape into the night. But the terrorists were determined and heavily armed. They forced their way inside through the sheer force of their weapons, and in the struggle to protect his athletes, Moshe was shot. He fell in the very doorway he had spent his final moments defending. Moshe had saved one life, but the nightmare was only beginning for the others. His blood on the threshold was the first sign that the Olympic spirit had been shattered. The gunmen took 9 other Israeli team members hostage. They demanded the release of hundreds of prisoners, starting a tense, heart-wrenching standoff that the whole world watched live on television. For the first time, an Olympic event wasn't about sports. It was a global crisis unfolding in real time. People in 900 million homes sat glued to their screens as the Games of Peace turned into a stage for international terror. The cameras that were meant to capture gold medals were now focused on masked men on balconies. The world watched and waited for a rescue, but the finish line for these athletes would be found at a dark airfield. German authorities tried to save the team at a nearby airport, but the plan was wrong and fell apart under pressure. In a chaotic, bloody firefight at the Fürstenfeldbruck airfield, the situation ended in total horror. All 9 remaining hostages were killed in the back of helicopters. By the time the sun came up, the Israeli team members were dead, along with 5 of the attackers and 1 German police officer. It remains the darkest, most painful chapter in the history of the modern Olympic Games. The Olympics were stopped for 34 hours as the world mourned the loss of innocent lives. The open village concept died that day, along with the athletes. Because of the sacrifice of Moshe Weinberg and his team, the Olympics changed forever. Every Games held since then has been guarded by high fences, armed security, and intense checkpoints. The era of the carefree Games ended in a Munich doorway, and the world could never quite trust the peace of the Olympic Village again. The Poisoned Boxer, August 15th, 1936. The summer heat hangs heavy over Berlin as the Nazi Olympics reach their final climactic days. Adolf Hitler is using these games to showcase a chilling vision of power to the rest of the world. Swastikas fly from every marble building, and the air is thick with the sound of marching boots. Nikolai Bereshay sits quietly in his quarters at the Olympic Village, still processing a loss from 4 days earlier. He has no idea he's about to become the most suspicious death in sporting history. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were a carefully staged show. The Nazi regime wanted to prove they were superior to everyone else, and the regime didn't like losing. Jewish athletes were pushed out, and foreign competitors were watched by secret police at every turn. Nikolai Bereshay was a featherweight boxer from Romania. Nikolai was a compact, technical fighter who had spent his entire youth training in small, dusty gyms to reach this stage. Nikolai wasn't a man of many words. He lets his fists do the talking. But in the hostile, high-pressure atmosphere of Hitler's Germany, the young boxer felt like a stranger in a very dangerous land. During Nikolai's match on August 11th, he fought hard, but Nikolai was eliminated in the first round. While most athletes would simply go home or stay to watch the other events, something about him began to change. He didn't just seem sad about the defeat, he seemed physically broken. Nikolai stayed behind in the Olympic Village, a place that was supposed to be for rest, but felt more like a golden cage. As the days passed, Nikolai's health began to slide into a terrifying downward spiral that no one could explain. In an era of secrets and propaganda, a simple boxing match for Nikolai is about to turn into a high-stakes murder mystery. It started with a small, painful bump on Nikolai's skin, a boil. In today's world, a doctor would give a patient a simple cream or a pill, and the patient would be fine. But in 1936, even a small infection could turn deadly. Within hours, the infection turned into blood poisoning. The toxins began to flood Nikolai's system, racing through Nikolai's veins and attacking his organs. Nikolai's fever spiked so high that he became delusional. German doctors in the village claimed the medical staff were doing everything possible for him, using the best medicines of the time, but he was fading fast. As the blood poisoning took over, Nikolai's skin turned a ghostly gray. His blood pressure tanked, and his heart struggled to pump blood to his brain. It looked like a tragic case of bad luck, an athlete who survived the boxing ring only to be killed by a tiny germ. But the timing was strange. Nikolai had been healthy and strong just days before. On August 15, 1936, only 4 days after his last fight, Nikolai Berichet took final breath in a Berlin hospital, thousands of miles away from the family that was waiting for him to come home. The official report said it was an accident, but the body of Nikolai was telling a much darker story. When the news reached Romania, officials were instantly suspicious of what happened to Nikolai. The Romanian officials knew the Nazi regime wasn't above using violence. The officials demanded a full autopsy to see what really killed him. According to reports from the time, the Romanian doctors found something horrifying. It wasn't just an infection in Nikolai's blood. The doctors allegedly found traces of actual poison. The doctors suspected that he hadn't just gotten sick. Nikolai had been eliminated on purpose. The reaction from the German authorities toward Nikolai's case was swift and cold. The Nazis didn't want a scandal ruining Hitler's perfect Olympics. German officials reportedly suppressed the investigation and buried his medical files. Most shockingly, the authorities refused to let Nikolai's body be sent back to Romania. Against the desperate screams of his family, the German government buried Nikolai right there in Berlin. The regime wanted the evidence underground where no one could ever find it again. This created a massive diplomatic fight regarding Nikolai Berichet, turning the games of peace into a scene of international anger. The truth of Nikolai's death was buried in a foreign grave, and the silence of the Nazi regime spoke louder than any official report ever could. To this day, the mystery of Nikolai Berichet remains unsolved. Was he just a victim of a time before modern medicine? Or was he the first person ever murdered at the Olympics because Nikolai knew something Nikolai shouldn't? Or simply because he was a failure in the eyes of a cruel regime? The fact that the Nazis refused to let Nikolai's body go home and hid the autopsy results suggests something far more evil than a simple infection for Nikolai Berichet. Marathon. July 14, 1912. The summer sun blazes mercilessly over Stockholm as marathon runners prepare to tackle 40.2 kilometers of Swedish countryside in temperatures that would reach a dangerous 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Francisco Lázaro is about to become Portugal's first Olympic marathon runner and the first Olympic athlete to die from competition-related causes. He thinks he has found a secret way to beat the sun, but in reality, Francisco Lázaro has just signed a death warrant with a bottle of wax. The 1912 Stockholm Olympics had drawn athletes from around the world to compete in what was still the early era of modern Olympic competition. Medical understanding of heat-related illness was limited. Safety protocols were virtually non-existent. The marathon course wound through rural areas with minimal water stations, creating conditions that would challenge even the most prepared athletes. Francisco was not prepared. Francisco adjusted a racing number as he prepared to represent Portugal in the nation's Olympic debut. The frame of Francisco reflected the determination that had brought him to Stockholm despite limited resources. He had trained in a milder climate and wasn't accustomed to running in the extreme heat that would define this Olympic marathon. The presence of Francisco at the Games represented an emergence in international athletics, and he carried the hopes of an entire nation on his shoulders. The marathon represented a chance for Francisco to bring honor to Portugal, a responsibility he took seriously despite his youth and inexperience. But here is where things went catastrophically wrong for Francisco. Francisco had covered his body with oil or wax in an attempt to prevent sweating, following advice that would prove tragically misguided. The substance would impair the natural cooling mechanisms of Francisco, contributing to the heat-related crisis that would claim the life of Francisco. Preparation had been limited by a lack of resources, and he had trained diligently at home, but nothing could have prepared Francisco for the combination of Olympic pressure and dangerous weather. The determination of Francisco to succeed for Portugal would override the warning signals of his body as the race progressed. The race began in dangerous conditions, with the temperature climbing toward levels that would challenge any distance runner. Francisco started conservatively, but the heat began taking its toll on him as he moved through the Swedish countryside. By the halfway point, Francisco was showing signs of severe heat exhaustion, but the determination of Francisco to finish and honor Portugal kept him moving forward. Spectators along the course noticed the distressed condition of Francisco as he struggled through the later stages of the race, but there were no medical personnel stationed along the route to provide assistance to Francisco. The body temperature of Francisco was rising to dangerous levels as his natural cooling systems failed. The combination of extreme heat and misguided tactics created a perfect storm of medical crisis for Francisco. Francisco collapsed at approximately the 19-mile mark. The body temperature of Francisco reached 106 degrees Fahrenheit as he suffered severe heat stroke. He never regained consciousness after falling to the ground. The Olympic dreams of Francisco ending on a dusty Swedish road far from home. Francisco was rushed to a Stockholm hospital, but the medical knowledge of 1912 was insufficient to treat him. Francisco died the following morning from complications related to heat stroke. He became the first Olympic athlete to die from competition-related causes. The death of Francisco shocked the international sports community and led to the implementation of medical stations and water stops. Portugal mourned its first Olympic athlete, and Francisco became a national hero despite the tragic outcome. The sacrifice of Francisco led to improved safety protocols that would protect future Olympic marathoners. Francisco was 21 years old when he became Portugal's first Olympic marathon runner in 1912. Francisco Lázaro covered his body with oil or wax to prevent sweating, following misguided advice that would destroy the ability of his body to cool itself. He ran through extreme heat with minimal water stations and no medical personnel. At the 19-mile mark, the body temperature of Francisco hit 106 degrees Fahrenheit, and he collapsed. Francisco Lázaro never regained consciousness. He died the next morning from heat stroke, becoming the first Olympic athlete to die from competition itself, and forcing the movement to recognize that safety protocols weren't optional. The death of Francisco changed marathon running forever, but it came too late to save him.